I'm Joe Agustinelli, Social Media Manager here at Greenway Health, and this is another edition of our podcast, Putting Possibility into Practice. And once again, I am joined by our Corporate Counsel for Regulatory Affairs, David Heller. David is a frequent guest on our podcast, as we always update you on the latest regulatory affairs happening in D.C. and affecting our providers around the country. And David had the opportunity to do two presentations and take part in an open panel at our recently completed Engage 2018 customer event up in National Harbor, Maryland, not too far from Washington, D.C. David, welcome to the podcast, and let's discuss what you talked about at Engage 18.
Sure. So, had really three discussions at Engage 2018. First one was about the quality payment program in 2019. So that's the merit-based incentive payment system, MIPS, and advanced alternative payment models. Also spoke about kind of what's going on in Washington, D.C. That's not related to MACRA. And they're really focused in on things like the opioids package that is before the Senate now. Also looked at different things happening in the regulatory pipeline, things related to 21st century cures and data sharing and a few different RFIs that are out there. Also did a panel discussion with product management, specifically Zach Blunt, Chris Gibson, Don Lane, who are over population health and analytics platforms here with a few of our customers, which was a really great interaction, I thought. So, not surprisingly, a lot of legislative and regulatory items, but felt like the conversations were really productive and had really engaged groups.
And speaking of having engaged groups, what were the questions and some of the details you were hearing from customers as to what they're looking out for in this final third of 2018 on the regulatory front?
So right now I actually think our practices and our customers are looking at the present and the past, not so much the future. And I say that just because a lot has happened very recently. So a lot of practices recently got their MIPS scores, and they know what their adjustments are going to be. And I think the largest thing I heard from providers was a bit of shock. So just for context, MIPS is scaled from 0 to 100, and supposedly if you breach 70, you're eligible for extra bonuses. Year one was supposed to be up to 4%. What providers are finding is that people who did really, really well still are only getting maybe a % adjustment. Like, I heard of one person who I think scored like a 72, and their adjusted rate was 1.2% out of 4. So I kind of think what the MGMA said and what other observers had said came to pass, that this is fundamentally a budget neutral program, and because it was so easy to pass, there wasn't going to be a lot of incentive money there. But I do think it kind of took providers by surprise, because a lot of them put in a lot of work for quite high scores and maybe feel like there's not a lot of reward right now. I do think there's a danger to that thinking, because the program becomes more aggressive over time, and eventually we'll get out of these transition years where it's just CMS kind of setting a performance threshold, and we'll move to a place where CMS uses the mean or median. Other things we're hearing from them, I did hear some interesting commentary around the proposed rule for the new Medicare Shared Savings Program. Or not the new one, but the recent proposed changes to it, which are rather extreme. Bottom line is that they're trying to get ACOs, or accountable care organizations, to take on risk at a much faster clip than they are today. So the idea of upside-only tracks is going to fade. Heard some commentary in a positive way. We represent ambulatory folks, or we have ambulatory folks as our clients. There's some commentary about how the rule has different policy levers to discourage hospital systems from just using it as a referral mechanism, which a lot of folks feel like it has been done because of the lack of downside risk. So there is some interesting commentary happening on that front. But as a whole, kind of felt like also very positive reception to the quality payment program reporting experience. So March 31 was the deadline that they all reported to MIPS for. Heard some really positive experiences in terms of how the reporting was streamlined compared to other years when the program was broken into 3 separate programs. So all in all, a pretty interesting experience, and great to hear how our providers are experiencing these programs on the ground.
And talking about the MIPS scores, when somebody says, oh, it isn't as much as I expected, do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing heading into 2019? 2019. I mean, if somebody's expecting somewhere up towards 4% because of their score and they end up getting, like you mentioned, 1.2, do you think it puts the mindset in as to why put in so much work if the reward isn't.
I think there's a danger there. So I do think there's definitely a danger that people say, well, I've invested all this time and got minimal ROI. I would just caution that this program has real teeth when it's fully implemented. So year one was by design not going to create a lot of incentives, just because they by design didn't want to penalize a whole bunch of folks. And that's going to be true to varying extents between now and 2022, which is when the program has full teeth. For the folks who did really, really well, I understand that it's frustrating, but I would just, kind of caution that it's not all for nothing. For one thing, you have the muscle memory for managing MIPS administratively, but also as that performance threshold increases, and this year it's going from 15 to 30 in 2019, progressively more people will be penalized. So that is something for folks to definitely keep in the back of their minds. Again, from 15 to 30 is a pretty extreme jump. Mm-hmm. In fact, CMS estimated that if they were to calculate the mean or median for 2019 based on what they saw with PQRS and meaningful use back in the day, it would have been somewhere between 60 and 70, which is an incredibly high performance threshold. So I would definitely keep an eye on the future that this stuff really does have teeth. And when mean and median scoring is introduced, I mean, just by design, a lot of people are going to fail the program.
Mm-hmm. And let's talk about one of the proposed changes for 2019. And what are your thoughts on the proposed changes to the quality payment program as we head into 2019?
So I'm fairly close, or I'm through the rule, and I have some mixed feelings. And this, I think, is pretty consistent with what we've said as a corporation in the past. Generally speaking, we welcome the reduction of administrative burden. So we think that where CMS is from a policy perspective is a good place. We think trying to reduce the burden on providers is a worthy goal. The devil is in the details, though. I think that the simplification of the scoring for the promoting interoperability category is a really good step in the right direction. Beforehand, there was a base score, performance score, bonus score, and it was fairly convoluted. They've done some simplification there. I think that the use and requirement of 2015 certified EHR technology is a really, really piece of good news. I know some providers are hesitant to implement those upgrades. I'd say is the new certified edition has a lot of really great functionality. Important to keep in mind the 2014 certified rule was written back in 2012. So, upgrading to the 2015 edition I think will be a substantial advancement technically for a lot of people and get more people on the same set of standards and technology. I do think that when they are looking at different measures, their general reliance on 2015 certified EHR technology is good because it allows vendors to build once and not multiple times for small variances. Where I see risk in this rule is really in two measures. I see risk with prescription drug monitoring programs, or PDMPs, and this is very much what we said when we commented on the proposed inpatient prospective payment system. This is going to be really messy state by state. There's not a uniform set of data standards or requirements. A lot of states ask for things in a non-standards based format or have implementation and testing cycles that aren't always practical. And there's no uniform baseline. And that's going to be problematic. We experienced a similar sort of issue with immunization registries and meaningful use stage 2. So we see that as a problem. And we're really hoping that CMS and even Congress, who's considering bills of this like, to get uniform standards in place for PDMP. Otherwise, it's not going to scale, I think, as quickly as policymakers and providers want it to. The other measure where we see some problems are in this measure called a Verify Opioid Treatment Agreement. And we see issues here, and I think CMS is aware of them too, because that measure doesn't define a document type. And it seems like it'd be very much reliant on provider action that isn't necessarily inside the EHR, or electronic health record, which makes us think, well, if it's not fully automatable through the EHR, does it belong in this category? Is there a different way we want to measure this? So we have concerns with that being in a category that's about measuring the use of technology, when from our perspective, the workflows don't necessarily all stay within the use of technology. I think that doubling the performance threshold from 15 to 30 is going to be less of an impact than I think some folks might say at first, because again, CMS's estimates were people did still quite well this past year anyways. I still think, going forward, the number of incentive dollars in this program for 2019 will be relatively low, just because 30 is not terribly, terribly high of a threshold to meet. The other area that flags us as a concern, and I think we commented on this in the inpatient prospective payment system, this RFI came up again, but looking at new ways to incent the use of interoperability through the conditions of participation with Medicare. We actually thought that was a rather extreme proposal, and we commented as such. We cautioned that, hey, this is something that could have unintended consequences. Think about the provider discontent with meaningful use. A lot of that was because of the perception that this was required, and there was a certain degree of blowback in terms of adoption there. We think that more stringent requirements, generally speaking, will generally result in more discontent. And we think the appropriate way to encourage the exchange of information or promote interoperability is by creating good business cases, not necessarily writing straight conditions of participation to Medicare. So there's a lot going on that we're looking at, and we have a lot of views. I think our general views come down to minimize disruption for our providers and us, and let us work around the problem sets in a way that's defined by markets. That generally tends to be kind of our approach and how we think about these programs.
And for more information on ongoing regulatory issues and changes and what's happening in DC, I invite you to always keep an eye on our website and on our social media networks, always with some great blogs and webinars that David is a part of, and sometimes some of our other team members here at Greenway Health who are perverse in this area much more than the rest of us are always sharing their wealth of knowledge on those issues. So I do invite you to stay tuned to our website and the Knowledge Center on our website at www.greenwayhealth.com. My guest, Corporate Counsel for Regulatory Affairs here at Greenway Health, David Heller. Before I let him go, though, we have to shift gears from the professional to the personal. I hear we're both huge college football fans, so I know the college football season just getting underway, and your pick as national champion in January?
So I'm a Florida State homer and alum, so I'm going to cut against the grain this year and every year and pick Florida State. New coach, new culture, feel like there's a lot of energy with the players in the campus, so really excited to see my team play.
As a ACC guy, but a Syracuse fan from upstate New York, I can't pick Syracuse because I know there's no shot. But I'll stay in the ACC, and I just don't want to pick Alabama again. But I'll stay in the ACC for my pick. I'm going to go with the Clemson Tigers. So we'll see what happens this college football season. Once again, I thank my guest, David Heller, Corporate Counsel for Regulatory Affairs here at Greenway Health, and you've heard him here on the podcast before, and he will be back once again as we continue to always keep you updated on regulatory issues and what's going on in DC that affects our providers and your practice. For David Heller, I'm Joe Augustinelli, the Social Media Manager at Greenway Health. Thank you for listening to this edition of Putting Possibility into Practice, the podcast from Greenway Health. I invite you to download and subscribe to our podcast on your platform of choice. The podcast now available on SoundCloud, in the Apple iTunes Store, on Google Play Music, and now available on the Stitcher app. Once again, Joe Augustinelli, Social Media Manager at Greenway Health, and thanks for listening to this episode of Putting Possibility into Practice.